The sky above Limgrave tore open like a wound in the flesh of reality itself. It happened without warning, without prophecy, without the trembling omens that usually preceded such violations of the natural order. One moment the clouds drifted in their lazy procession above the rolling hills, painted gold by the distant Erdtree's eternal light. The next, a jagged fissure split the heavens, bleeding not blood but pure radiance, a green so vibrant it seemed to reject the muted palette of the lands between entirely. The soldiers at Gatefront Ruins saw it first. Godric's men, most of them, conscripts bearing chipped swords and shields emblazoned with the grafted lord's grotesque heraldry. They had been standing watch over nothing in particular, as soldiers often do, their vigilance dulled by months of stalemate in a war that had long since lost any coherent purpose. When the light erupted overhead, several dropped their weapons. One man fell to his knees and began muttering prayers to a golden order that had stopped listening generations ago. Another simply ran, which under the circumstances showed more wisdom than cowardice. The rift burned for 7 seconds. Those who survived to tell the tale would remember the count precisely, as humans always do when confronted with the impossible. 7 seconds of reality screaming in a voice that had no sound but could be felt in the bones. 7 seconds of every bird within a mile taking flight in panic. 7 seconds of the wind itself seeming to hold its breath. Then something fell through. He hit the earth outside the ruins with enough force to crack the stone beneath him, landing in a crouch that somehow absorbed the impact with practiced ease. The rift sealed behind him instantly, the sky knitting itself back together, as though embarrassed by its own momentary lapse in structural integrity. Silence rushed back in to fill the void, broken only by the distant caw of crows and the ragged breathing of terrified men. The figure rose slowly. He was small by the standards of the lands between, perhaps 5 feet and a handful of inches, which made him shorter than even the average Tarnished. But there was something in the way he moved that suggested size had very little to do with threat. He wore a tunic and cap of green so pure it seemed to have been stolen from a world where color hadn't yet learned to fade. Blonde hair caught what remained of the afternoon light. On his back rested a shield painted blue and red, and a sword in a scabbard that hummed with a note just below the threshold of hearing. His eyes were what struck the soldiers most, those few brave or foolish enough to keep watching. Blue and clear and utterly, devastatingly calm. The eyes of someone who had walked into the throne rooms of gods and made them blink first. Link took in his surroundings with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to waking up in places he didn't recognize. His hand moved to the sword's hilt by instinct, not drawing it but confirming its presence the way other men might touch a prayer beads or a lucky coin. The massive tree glowing in the distance caught his attention immediately. Trees that size generally meant something important, usually divine, occasionally apocalyptic. Often all three. The ruins sprawled before him, stone and wood twisted together in that particular way that suggested both age and violence. Banners bearing a symbol he didn't recognize hung limp in the still air. And everywhere, that strange golden light, softer than sunlight but somehow more oppressive, as though the illumination itself carried weight. "Intruder at the gate," one of the soldiers finally managed to croak out, his voice cracking halfway through the word gate. He was a young man, barely 20, with the kind of wispy beard that suggested hope rather than reality. His spear shook in his hands like a branch in a storm. Link looked at him, just looked, nothing more, but the young soldier took an involuntary step backward. There was no malice in that gaze, which somehow made it worse. It was the look of someone performing a calculation, measuring variables, determining whether violence would be necessary or if there might be a more efficient path forward. "Hold there," another soldier commanded, this one older, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived long enough to earn a few scars and therefore assumed he knew what danger looked like. He was wrong, of course, but confidence and accuracy rarely keep the same company. "State your purpose, stranger. These lands belong to Godric the Grafted, and none pass without his leave." Link's expression didn't change. He took a single step forward, not aggressive, merely repositioning, and 6 men immediately shifted into defensive stances. The older soldier's confidence wavered like a candle in a draft. I said, "Hold." The command came out more plea than order this time. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rot from somewhere to the east, mixed with something else, something that might have been decay or might have been rebirth. The distinction seemed academic in a place like this. Link's hand remained on his sword, though he still hadn't drawn it. He was waiting, watching, reading the situation with the patience of someone who understood that the first move often mattered less than the right move. One of the younger soldiers, perhaps braver or more foolish than his companions, raised a crossbow. His hands trembled badly enough that the bolt would likely miss by a yard even at this distance, but intent mattered more than accuracy when it came to crossing certain lines. Link's eyes narrowed fractionally. It was the smallest change in expression, barely noticeable, but suddenly the air felt heavier. The soldier with the crossbow found his finger frozen on the trigger, not from fear precisely, though that was present too, but from some deeper instinct that lived in the blood and bone. The instinct that told prey when it had wandered into the territory of something that ate prey for breakfast. The standoff held for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then Link did something that confused the soldiers more than any threat could have. He raised his left hand, palm forward, in a gesture that was unmistakably peaceful. Not surrendering, exactly. More like a hunter showing an animal he meant no harm before walking past it to find something worth actual hunting. The older soldier blinked, thrown completely off script. In his experience, intruders either attacked or fled or begged. They did not offer casual diplomatic gestures while standing in a crater of their own making, dressed like some forest spirit's fever dream, radiating the kind of casual competence that made professional soldiers feel like children playing with wooden swords. "Lower your weapons," the older soldier said quietly. The young man with the crossbow looked at him like he'd suggested they all hold hands and sing. "I said lower them. This one hasn't drawn steel. We show the same courtesy until we know what we're dealing with." It was sound reasoning, born from the kind of pragmatism that kept men alive in the lands between. The young soldier lowered his crossbow with visible reluctance, though his finger stayed near the trigger. The others followed suit, adopting a posture that was less aggressive, more warily observant, like guards who had just realized they might be guarding the wrong side of the door. Link nodded once, a small acknowledgement of their choice, then turned his attention back to the landscape. His gaze swept across the ruins, past them to the rolling hills beyond, then up to that massive golden tree dominating the distant horizon. His eyes lingered there for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Not quite recognition, but perhaps its cousin. He had seen world trees before. They were never just trees. "You speak our tongue, stranger?" the older soldier tried, his voice carefully neutral. Link glanced at him but offered no response. The soldier tried again, slower this time, as if volume and enunciation might somehow translate across whatever void this green-clad warrior had fallen through. "Where do you hail from? What brings you to the lands between?" Silence. Link's attention had already moved on, tracking something the soldiers couldn't see or hear. His head tilted slightly, an almost animal gesture, as though he were listening to a conversation happening just beyond the range of normal human senses. His hand drifted away from his sword to a pouch at his belt, and he produced something that made 2 of the soldiers take an involuntary step backward. It was a slate of some kind, roughly the size of a large book, smooth and dark with glowing symbols that pulsed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Link studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, then tapped one of the symbols. The device emitted a soft chime that sounded like it came from a world with friendlier rules than this one. "Sorcery," one of the younger soldiers whispered, making a warding gesture that probably hadn't worked since before the shattering, if it had ever worked at all. "He's a sorcerer from the academy." "That's no glintstone magic," the older soldier muttered back. He was right. The light from Link's device was warmer, more alive somehow, lacking the cold, stellar quality of Raya Lucaria's sorceries. This was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into the neat categories the lands between used to sort power into manageable boxes. Link seemed to reach some kind of conclusion based on whatever his device told him. He tucked it away and finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost soft, which made the soldiers lean in to hear it. That was a mistake. Quiet didn't mean weak. Sometimes quiet meant the speaker didn't need volume to make themselves understood. "The tree," Link said, pointing toward the Erd tree. His accent was strange, each word shaped slightly differently than the lands between's common tongue, but comprehensible. "What is it?" The soldiers exchanged glances, trying to determine if this was some kind of test or trap or elaborate joke. Asking what the Erd tree was seemed roughly equivalent to asking what the sun was, or what air was, or why water flowed downward. These were truths so fundamental that questioning them felt like questioning reality itself. "It's the Erd tree," the older soldier said slowly, as one might explain the obvious to a child or someone who had suffered a severe blow to the head. "The golden boughs. The symbol of the greater will's grace. Where do you come from that you don't know the Erd tree?" Link processed this information with the same neutral expression he'd worn since arriving. If he was impressed or concerned or confused, his face wasn't volunteering that intelligence. He simply nodded, filing the information away in whatever mental catalog he maintained for dealing with new worlds and their attendant complications. And yes, the soldiers thought, that was exactly how he behaved. Like this was not his first time arriving somewhere completely foreign and having to rapidly assemble context from confused locals and divine landmarks. "Who rules here?" Link asked next. Direct, efficient, cutting through layers of potential conversation to reach the relevant core. The soldiers were starting to understand that this was how he operated. Minimal words, maximum information. No time wasted on pleasantries or elaborate explanations. "Godric the Grafted holds these lands," the older soldier replied, then added with a hint of something that might have been pride or might have been resignation. "He is a demigod, bearer of a great rune, descended from the golden lineage itself." Link's expression changed for the first time since arriving. It wasn't fear, exactly, or even particular concern. More like recognition of a familiar pattern. His hand returned to his sword hilt in a gesture so casual it took a moment for the soldiers to register the threat. Not because he planned to draw it now, necessarily, but because he had just learned something that suggested he might need it soon. "Demigod," Link repeated, tasting the word. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "There's always a demon king." The older soldier didn't quite catch that last muttered comment, which was probably for the best. Before he could ask Link to repeat himself, the decision of what to do with this strange intruder was taken out of his hands entirely. A horn sounded from deeper within the ruins, low and brassy, the kind of note that made smart men check their weapons and fools check their courage. Neither check usually came back with reassuring results. "Company approaches," one of the younger soldiers hissed, pointing toward the interior of Gatefront. Through the broken archways and collapsed walls, movement stirred. Torchlight flickered despite the afternoon sun, because Godric's forces had learned that darkness was a state of mind rather than a time of day in the lands between. Where there was Godric, there was usually something that preferred shadows. What emerged into the courtyard made the soldiers stiffen. At their head walked a knight in armor that had once been fine but was now a patchwork of mismatched pieces, as though the wearer had looted 3 different corpses and combined their protection into something that worked through sheer, stubborn refusal to acknowledge aesthetics. Behind him came a squad of 8 soldiers in similar states of mix and match equipment, and behind them, something that made Link's hand tighten on his sword. It walked on 4 legs that had belonged to at least 3 different creatures. Its torso was human, or had been, before someone had decided that 2 arms weren't enough and added 4 more in a configuration that ignored conventional wisdom about skeletal structure and blood flow. What passed for its head sprouted from shoulders like a tumor with eyes. This was a grafted scion, one of Godric's experimental successes, if success was measured purely by whether the thing could still move and kill after you were done stitching it together. The knight's eyes locked onto Link immediately. Whatever else could be said about Godric's officers, they knew how to identify problems, and a stranger standing in a fresh crater glowing with residual energy definitely qualified. The knight raised one gauntleted fist, and his squad fanned out with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The grafted scion shambled forward eagerly, drooling from 3 mouths that had been sewn into its chest cavity. Someone had given it a sense of taste again. That person had been cruel. "You there!" the knight barked at Link, his voice carrying the particular brand of authority that came from being allowed to wear better armor than everyone else. "Kneel before your betters. You stand in lands claimed by Godric the Golden, and you will show proper deference or lose the legs that let you stand." Link looked at the knight, then at the grafted scion, then back at the knight. His expression suggested he was performing some kind of internal calculation, the way a craftsman might assess whether a job required the good tools or if the cheap ones would suffice. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, then crossed over into insulting. "I asked you a question, outsider," the knight said, his voice dropping into a register that suggested patience was not among his virtues. "Kneel, or I'll have my pet teach you how." The grafted scion gurgled something that might have been enthusiasm. Link's gaze dropped to the abomination, studying it with the clinical detachment of someone examining a particularly ugly puzzle. His eyes tracked the way it moved, noting which limbs bore weight, which were decorative, where the grafts had been fused and where they remained weak. It took him perhaps 4 seconds to completely map the creature's vulnerabilities. He'd fought worse, he'd fought weirder. Once he'd fought something that was both worse and weirder while it was on fire and he was underwater, which had been a very strange afternoon. "Last warning," the knight said, drawing his sword. It was a decent blade, well maintained, the kind of weapon a competent soldier might carry for years and trust with his life. Against Link, it would last approximately as long as morning dew on hot stone. Link reached over his shoulder and drew the master sword. The sound it made leaving the scabbard was soft, almost musical, a whisper of steel and something else, something older. The blade gleamed in the Erd tree's light, but the gleam was wrong. It didn't reflect the golden radiance so much as refract it, turning it into something purer, colder. The sword had been forged to seal darkness. The lands between were lousy with darkness. The blade practically hummed with purpose. Several of the soldiers took involuntary steps backward. The older soldier who had tried to communicate with Link earlier felt his mouth go dry. He had seen many swords in his years. He had seen blessed blades and cursed blades and blades so old they had outlived the civilizations that forged them. But this was something different. This was a sword that looked at other swords the way wolves looked at dogs and wondered what had gone so terribly wrong. The knight hesitated, which was the first crack in his authority. Then he made the choice that brave or stupid men always make when confronted with something that makes them hesitate. He attacked anyway. "Kill him!" he snarled at the grafted scion. And the abomination lunged forward with surprising speed, its multiple limbs propelling it across the courtyard in a skittering rush that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer biomechanical wrongness. Link sidestepped. It was not a large movement. He simply wasn't where the grafted scion expected him to be when its 6 arms came down in a hammering blow that cracked the stone where he'd been standing a fraction of a second earlier. The creature's momentum carried it past him, and as it did, Link's blade flickered out once, twice, 3 times in cuts so precise they looked almost lazy. The grafted scion took 4 more steps before it realized it was dead. Then it collapsed into its component parts, which had the grace to separate along the original graft lines. Link hadn't just killed it, he'd disassembled it, neatly. The knight stared at the dismantled corpse for 2 heartbeats, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had just witnessed. The grafted scion had been one of Godric's prized creatures, a testament to the Lord's ambition and disregard for natural law. It had killed 7 men in its last outing. Link had reduced it to a craft project gone wrong in the time it took to blink. "Formation," the knight croaked, and his soldiers moved with the jerky urgency of men who suddenly understood they were standing in the shallows while something very large and hungry circled just offshore. They formed a semicircle, spears lowered, shields raised. Standard tactics against a single opponent. It might even have worked if the opponent had been standard. Link didn't wait for them to finish arranging themselves. He moved forward with the fluid grace of water, finding the path of least resistance, and his sword moved with him. The first soldier's spear deflected off the Hylian's shield with a sound like a bell cracking. The second soldier tried to thrust low, aiming for the legs. Link jumped, a simple vertical leap that carried him higher than any man his size should have been able to manage, and landed behind the formation. His blade sang twice. 2 soldiers fell, not dead but clutching hamstrung legs, removed from the fight with surgical precision. The knight roared something incoherent and charged. He was brave, and he was trained, and under different circumstances he might have been dangerous. But courage without wisdom was just elaborate suicide, and Link had been killing things that actually posed a threat since before this knight had learned to hold a practice sword. The master sword caught the knight's blade in a bind, twisted, and the knight's weapon went spinning away across the courtyard. Link's follow-through put the flat of his blade against the knight's throat, a clear message. "I could have. I didn't. Consider that a gift." The knight fell to his knees, not from the blow but from the sudden understanding that he was still alive purely by Link's choice. The remaining soldiers dropped their weapons with a clatter that sounded like common sense arriving fashionably late to the party. "Sweet, merciful roots, what was that?" A voice called out from behind a broken wall, high-pitched and oddly cheerful despite the carnage. Link spun, shield up, sword ready, and found himself staring at a pot, a person-sized pot, with arms and a face, if you counted the painted-on features and the gap where a mouth would be. The jar warrior shuffled into view, dragging what appeared to be a rusty greatsword that it had no business being able to lift. Its clay body was cracked and patched, decorated with faded designs that might have been ceremonial or might have been boredom-induced doodles. Link lowered his sword slightly but kept his guard. He had learned long ago that the strange and harmless-looking were often neither. "That was incredible," the jar continued, its voice echoing from somewhere inside its hollow body. "The way you moved, the precision, the absolute refusal to kill when you could simply incapacitate instead. I haven't seen swordsmanship like that since ever really. Iron Fist Alexander is my name, warrior and wanderer, and I must say you've made quite the entrance." Link regarded the talking pot with the expression of someone who had seen too much weirdness to be properly surprised anymore, but maintained a baseline level of healthy suspicion about anything that shouldn't be able to talk but did. Anyway, he sheathed his sword slowly, a peace offering, though his hand stayed near the hilt. "You're not from around here, are you?" Alexander said, shuffling closer with the scraping sound of clay on stone. "The way you fight, the equipment, that magnificent glow from your blade, you're tarnished, perhaps? Though you lack the typical look of someone crawling out of a grave and pretending everything is fine." Before Link could respond, if he had planned to respond at all, the earth trembled, not metaphorically. Actually shook, a deep bass rumble that came from somewhere to the south, beyond the ruins, out in the open fields where things with too many limbs and not enough sense tended to congregate. Alexander's painted face somehow managed to convey alarm despite being, again, paint. "Oh no," the jar warrior said. "That would be the tibia mariner. Nasty bit of work, that one. Summons the dead. Rides a spectral boat across dry land like water is a suggestion rather than a requirement, generally makes a nuisance of itself. It's been circling closer to the ruins for days. I don't suppose you'd be interested in." Link was already moving. He vaulted over a collapsed section of wall, hit the ground running. and headed toward the source of the trembling with the focused determination of someone who had learned that running toward the problem was usually faster than waiting for the problem to come to you. Alexander watched him go, then looked at the stunned soldiers. "Well," the jar said, "he certainly doesn't waste time, does he? I think I'll follow along. This should be educational." Link crested a small rise and saw it immediately. The tibia mariner drifted across the grass like a drunk ghost operating a vessel it barely understood, its skeletal form hunched over oars that pushed through reality rather than water. Around it, the dead pulled themselves from the earth, skeletons mostly, armed with rusted weapons and animated by spite and necromantic energy. They shambled toward the ruins in a loose formation, drawn by the sounds of combat or perhaps just following the mariner's cruel whim. Link reached for his belt and produced something the lands between had never seen before. A bow materialized in his hands, sleek and strange, humming with potential energy. He knocked an arrow in a single fluid motion, the kind of movement that spoke of 10,000 repetitions until muscle memory became instinct, became art. The bow was already drawn before the skeletons registered his presence, and Link's eyes narrowed as he calculated trajectory, wind speed, distance. The mathematics of murder solved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The arrow left the string with a sound like tearing silk. It crossed the 100 yards between Link and the tibia mariner in less than a second, trailing a faint blue light that seemed wrong for this world, too clean, too pure. The shaft took the skeletal captain directly in the skull, and the resulting explosion was not fire or force but something else entirely. Reality hiccuped. The mariner's bones scattered like dropped sticks, the spectral boat dissolved into mist, and every skeleton within 30 feet simply ceased, their animating magic severed at the source. Alexander crested the rise behind Link, puffing slightly despite being ajar, and therefore theoretically not subject to respiratory limitations. "Ancient arrows." The pot warrior wheezed. "You have ancient arrows. How in the name of the Erd tree do you have ancient arrows? Those aren't even from this world. Nothing in this world makes weapons like that." Link had already moved on, literally. He was sliding down the hill toward the remaining skeletons, bow vanishing back into whatever impossible space he stored his equipment, sword returning to his hand like an old friend coming home. The undead turned toward him with the jerky uncertainty of things that ran on instructions rather than intelligence. Attack the living. Simple directive. Unfortunately for them, Link had been killing the undead since he was 10 years old. And these particular specimens were distinctly underwhelming compared to some of the things he'd faced in haunted temples and cursed crypts. His blade moved through them like wind through wheat. Precise cuts that separated skulls from spines, severed the specific bones that held necromantic energy, dismantled the dead with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how reanimation magic worked and where its structural weaknesses lived. Within 30 seconds, the field was quiet again, littered with bones that would not be rising a second time. Link surveyed the aftermath with clinical detachment, then began methodically checking the remains. He produced small pouches from his belt and started collecting things. A finger bone here, a tooth there, a piece of corroded metal that might have been part of an ancient weapon. Alexander watched this process with fascination. "You loot," the jar said, his tone suggesting this was somehow simultaneously expected and mildly surprising. "Of course you loot. Why waste good materials? Practical. I respect that. Most warriors here in the lands between are too proud or too cursed to bother with the aftermath. They kill and move on, leaving perfectly good resources to rot in the grass." Link glanced up at Alexander, his expression suggesting mild curiosity about why a pot was lecturing him on resource management, but he didn't stop collecting. When he was satisfied, he stood and looked toward the horizon where the massive golden tree dominated the skyline. His gaze was calculating, measuring distance, considering approach vectors. Alexander recognized that look. It was the expression of someone planning a route to somewhere very dangerous, carried by someone who considered dangerous a starting point rather than a destination. "The Erd tree calls to you," Alexander observed. "It calls to everyone eventually. But the path there goes through Stormvale Castle, and Stormvale means Godric. You've already made an impression on his soldiers. Word will spread. He'll know you're coming. Link's response was to start walking, not toward Stormvale directly, but angling off to the side, toward a path that wound through the hills. Alexander hurried to follow, his clay body making scraping sounds against the grass and stone. Wait, where are you going? The castle is that way. Unless you plan to go around, that could work. The long route through Liurnia, perhaps? Or, oh, you could try the cliffside path, though that's crawling with bats the size of horses and at least 2 trolls that I know of. Not friendly trolls either, if such a thing exists. Link ignored the commentary, his attention focused on something ahead. A structure loomed at the edge of the path, stone and wood twisted together into something between a building and a growth. Torchlight flickered in glassless windows. The Church of Ella, abandoned by priests but occupied by something else. Something that had been waiting patiently for travelers to wander within range. The doors exploded outward before Link was within 50 feet, and what emerged made Alexander let out a sound like a kettle whistling. A grafted abomination, larger than the scion from before, assembled from at least a dozen corpses and held together by Godric's signature blend of ambition and madness. It had too many arms, each holding a different weapon, and too many legs working in a coordination that should have been impossible but somehow wasn't. Its multiple faces screamed in unison, a chorus of the dead given one final terrible purpose. Link stopped walking. His left hand moved to his shield. His right tightened on the Master Sword's grip. And for the first time since arriving in the lands between, something that might have been a smile ghosted across his features. Not happiness, exactly. More like recognition. This was familiar ground. This was what he did. A monster that needed killing, a sword that needed swinging, and the simple mathematical certainty that one of them would not be standing when this was finished. The abomination charged, its multiple legs eating distance with horrifying speed, weapons raised in a forest of steel and malice. Link's shield came up to catch the first 3 strikes, the impacts ringing like broken bells. His sword flickered out between the attacks, finding gaps in the creature's guard that shouldn't have existed, creating new weaknesses where none had been before. The abomination's 4th arm swung a massive club downward with enough force to crater stone. Link wasn't there. He had rolled between 2 of the creature's legs, a tight, controlled movement that put him behind the monstrosity before it could pivot. His sword carved through the tendons of its rear legs, not severing them completely but cutting deep enough to compromise balance. The creature stumbled, its coordination fracturing, and that moment of instability was all Link needed. He vaulted onto its back, boots finding purchase on shoulders that belonged to 3 different people, and drove the Master Sword down through what passed for the thing's central mass. The blade bit deep, finding the focal point where Godric's grafting magic held the whole obscene structure together. Light erupted from the wound, not golden like the Erdtree's grace, but white and pure and utterly unforgiving. The abomination thrashed once, twice, and then collapsed into its component parts with a wet finality that made Alexander look away despite being a pot, and therefore theoretically immune to squeamishness. Link landed in a crouch as the corpse pile settled, his breathing barely elevated, already scanning for the next threat. When none immediately presented itself, he straightened and wiped his blade clean on a piece of relatively intact cloth from one of the bodies. The Master Sword gleamed, unblemished, as though the violence it had just participated in had been beneath its notice. "Magnificent," Alexander said, his voice containing genuine awe mixed with what might have been concern. "Though I worry you're making quite the reputation already. Godric doesn't take kindly to people dismantling his creations. He'll consider it a personal insult. He's very sensitive about his grafting work." Link walked to the church entrance, stepping over the broken doors, and disappeared inside. Alexander followed after a moment's hesitation, squeezing his bulk through the doorway with some difficulty. The interior was dim, lit by candles that had burned down to worried stubs. At the far end, near what had once been an altar, A merchant sat huddled in traveling robes, his eyes wide with the particular brand of terror that came from watching your only exit get demolished by a monster. "Thank the stars," the merchant gasped. "I thought I was done for. That thing has been circling this church for hours, and I couldn't slip past it. Merchant Kale, at your service. And I owe you my life." He paused, taking in Link's unusual appearance, the still glowing sword. The way the warrior moved with the casual confidence of someone who considered giant, murderous amalgamations a minor inconvenience. "You're not tarnished. At least, not like any tarnished I've seen. Where do you hail from, stranger?" Link approached the merchant's spread of goods, his eyes scanning the various items laid out on worn cloth. Smithing stones, bolts, a few arrows of standard quality, some crafting materials that looked like they'd been scavenged from things best left unscavenged. He pointed at several items, then reached for the pouch at his belt. What he produced made Kale lean forward with interest. Rupees, dozens of them, glittering in colors that ranged from green to blue to red. They caught the candlelight and threw it back in prismatic patterns that had no business existing in the muted palette of the lands between. Kale picked one up, turning it over in his fingers, testing its weight. I've never seen currency like this. What are they, gems, crystallized magic? They're exquisite." He bit one experimentally, a merchant's instinct, then nodded. "They'll spend. I don't know what they're worth in runes, but I'll take them at fair value, better than fair, for the man who saved my hide." Link selected several bundles of arrows, some throwing knives, and a small whetstone. He added a lantern for good measure, then paused at a small item tucked in the corner of Kale's display. A map fragment, partial, showing the region around Stormvale Castle in rough detail. His finger tapped it, a question. Interested in the castle? Can't say I recommend it unless you're suicidal or immortal or both. Godric the Grafted holds court there, and he's been getting worse. Desperate, some say. The shattering left him with a great rune but not much else, and he's been trying to make up the difference by bolting every poor soul he can capture onto his own body. He's more patchwork than person now, though I suppose that's most of us these days. Link studied the map with the intensity of someone who had navigated hostile territories using nothing but crude sketches and educated guesses. He committed the layout to memory in seconds, that peculiar skill that separated heroes from corpses. Then he looked at Kale directly, waiting. "You want to know how to get there," Kale said, understanding. "Well, the main gate is right through those ruins you arrived at, but it's heavily guarded and Godric knows everything that approaches that way. There's a side path, though. Cliffside route that swings around to a postern gate, more dangerous in terms of terrain and what lives on the cliffs, but less likely to have an army waiting for you at the end." He paused. "You're actually going to challenge him, aren't you? You just arrived in the lands between and you're planning to walk into Stormvale and kill a demigod." It wasn't really a question, but Link nodded anyway. Simple, direct confirmation. Yes, that was exactly the plan. It was always the plan. Find the source of the darkness, the corruption, the wrongness, and deal with it. Usually that meant fighting something large and terrible. Sometimes it meant solving elaborate puzzles. Occasionally it involved both simultaneously, which was always interesting. "Mad," Kale muttered, but he was smiling slightly. "Completely mad. I like you, stranger. Tell you what, you survive, Godric. You come back here and I'll have better stock for you. Deal?" Link offered his hand. Kale shook it, sealing the bargain, and watched as the green-clad warrior collected his purchases and headed for the door. The cliffside path proved exactly as treacherous as advertised. Bats the size of small horses hung from outcroppings, their leathery wings folded around bodies that pulsed with unwholesome life. Link dispatched them with arrows, each shot placed with the precision of someone who had learned archery from a race that could hit targets from horseback at full gallop. The bats fell without ceremony, tumbling into the mist-shrouded valleys below. Alexander had chosen to part ways at the church, citing some personal quest involving a festival and a warrior he needed to find. Link suspected the jar simply recognized that what came next was the kind of business best handled alone. Some fights required witnesses. Others required privacy, if only so the full extent of the violence could be contained to those who had volunteered for it. The postern gate hung open like a mouth forgotten mid-scream. No guards watched it, which should have been Link's first warning. The second warning came from the courtyard beyond, where bodies lay in poses that suggested they had died running toward the gate rather than defending it. Something had gone wrong in Stormvale Castle. Something beyond the usual wrongness that permeated Godric's domain. Link moved through corridors that reeked of old blood and fresh fear, following the sound of something massive moving through stone hallways. The architecture here had the desperate quality of a place that had been repaired too many times with insufficient materials and declining skill. Tapestries hung in tatters. Suits of armor stood empty, their former occupants redistributed across Godric's body or his various grafted experiments. The throne room doors were already open. Link paused at the threshold, taking in the space beyond with tactical efficiency. The chamber was vast, pillared, lit by torches that burned with chemical desperation. And at its center, seated on a throne made from the bones of things that had probably asked to remain buried, sat Godric the Grafted. He was enormous, not tall so much as accumulated, layer upon layer of stolen flesh and borrowed limbs, creating something that resembled a person the way a landslide resembles a hill. Arms sprouted from his torso in clusters, each grafted from a different source, creating a forest of limbs that moved with disturbing coordination. His original face remained visible, barely, consumed by desperation and madness in equal measure. Another Tarnished, Godric rumbled, his voice layered as though a dozen throats contributed to the sound. Come to mock me. Come to judge the Lord of Limgrave for doing what was necessary. I am the Golden Blood. I am the true inheritor of Godfrey's legacy. He stood, and the movement was like watching a building decide to walk. And you will become part of my perfection. Link drew the Master Sword. In the torchlight, the blade's glow intensified, responding to the concentration of wrongness before it. Godric was everything the sword had been forged to oppose. Corruption wearing ambition's face, darkness dressed in borrowed divinity, a perversion of the natural order that had convinced itself it was progress. Godric's laugh was bitter thunder. A toy sword for a toy hero. I have slain champions. I have grafted their strength to mine. What can one small man with one small blade hope to accomplish? Link's response was to move. Not toward Godric, but sideways, a sudden burst of speed that put him along the room's perimeter. Godric's many arms lashed out, weapons appearing in grasping hands, but Link was already gone. He had fought large opponents before. Size was a disadvantage disguised as strength. More mass meant more momentum, which meant slower reactions, predictable movements. The first exchange lasted 3 seconds. Godric's axe came down where Link had been standing. Link's sword opened a line across the demigod's nearest grafted arm, severing the tendons that allowed it to function. The limb went slack, dead weight hanging from Godric's shoulder. 6 arms remained. Insect! Godric roared, and golden light erupted from his great rune. Power flooded through him, the stolen strength of the Elden Ring's fragments surging through his patchwork body. He moved faster now, his remaining arms coordinating in patterns that would have overwhelmed any normal warrior. Link was not a normal warrior. He had defeated Ganondorf, the King of Evil, multiple times across multiple incarnations. He had conquered demons and dark wizards and gods that had forgotten humility. Godric was dangerous, certainly. He was empowered by divine runes and accumulated strength. But he was not the first tyrant to stand between Link and what needed doing, and he would not be the last. The fight became a lesson in efficiency versus desperation. Every movement Link made served multiple purposes. A dodge that avoided one attack positioned him to counter another. A parry with his shield redirected force while his sword found gaps in Godric's guard. He carved through grafted limbs with surgical precision, not killing but dismantling, reducing the demigod piece by piece to something manageable. Godric's roars became screams, became whimpers. His great rune pulsed with increasing desperation, but power without skill was just violence in fancier clothes. When his last functional arm fell away, severed at the shoulder, he collapsed to his knees. The throne room fell silent except for his labored breathing and the quiet hum of the master sword. Link stood before him, blade raised for the final strike. Godric looked up with his original eyes, the ones that had belonged to him before ambition and inadequacy had driven him to this. "I am of the golden lineage," he whispered. "I am Godfrey's blood." Link's expression was unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying weight that armor and size never could. "A king who builds himself from stolen parts is no king at all." The master sword fell. Light erupted, not the golden light of the Erd tree, but something purer, a radiance that seemed to cleanse as it destroyed. Godric the grafted dissolved, his great runes shattering into motes that drifted upward like dying stars. Link stood in the aftermath, breathing steady, and felt the familiar sensation of completion. The corruption was removed. The source of darkness, at least this local concentrated source, had been dealt with. It was not a permanent solution. It never was. Evil had a way of returning, often with interest, but that was tomorrow's problem. The throne room doors burst open behind him. Soldiers poured in, weapons ready, only to stop when they saw their lord reduced to fading light and scattered armor. The lead soldier, the same older man from the gate front, lowered his spear slowly. "He's gone," the soldier said, wonder and fear mixing in his voice. "Godric is gone. What happens now?" Link sheathed his sword and walked toward the exit. As he passed the soldier, he paused and placed something in the man's hand. A green rupee, glowing softly. Not currency here, perhaps, but a symbol nonetheless. A promise that someone had cared enough to remove a tyrant, even if that someone was just passing through. Outside Stormvale, the sky remained its usual troubled gray, but somehow it seemed lighter. The Erd tree's glow pulsed in the distance, mysterious and calling. Link stood on the castle ramparts and felt the familiar pull of destiny tugging at him. There were more demigods out there, more corruption, more darkness wearing power's face. He had been here before, in different forms, different worlds, always the same pattern, always the next horizon calling, always another kingdom needing someone willing to stand between the darkness and the light. But that was fine. That was what he did. That was what he had always done. Link adjusted his cap, checked his equipment, and began the long walk toward the next adventure. Behind him, Stormvale's soldiers watched the green-clad stranger disappear into the Lands Between's troubled landscape, carrying hope like a sword and leaving stories in his wake. The Lands Between would remember him. Not by name, perhaps. Few ever learned his name. But they would remember that someone had come, had fought, and had reminded them that tyranny was not inevitable. That evil could be opposed. That even in a world as broken as this, heroes still walked.